Welcome to another episode of the Erasing Shame podcast. My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm joined with my co-host, Eunice Lee, for episode number 5. And tonight we're having open mic night. Eunice, how are you doing?
I'm good, DJ. How are you?
Good. And so for open mic night, we're going to rewind and review what we've learned in the first month and share about the feedback and comments that we've gotten both online on our Facebook page as well as conversations that we've had on the ground and in person as we've interacted with people. And I've had a number of opportunities to talk about starting this podcast, and it seems to always get people's attention and they're curious. So that's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so great. Just in the last month as I've been sharing about this podcast, and the reaction I get from a lot of Asian Americans is like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we need. I think I've heard so many stories of people who have shared their own experiences of shame or have heard other people's experiences of shame. And so it's really great that we have a space to do this. And especially that's live on Facebook. It's our own vulnerability being put out there. And we're all risking a lot just to be up here. So thank you to those who are listening.
Yes, well, thank you for joining me. So Eunice, let's start with our starting point. We want to have a point of reference for shame, and then we'll get into our conversations for today.
Yeah. So we kind of balance off of Brene Brown's definition of shame, which is that guilt is something that you did wrong or I was wrong, and shame is that you are wrong. So guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is that you are wrong. And then it's kind of elevated to this other level because the Asian American community is so small and so tight knit. And shame is sometimes used as a tool to keep people in line. So there's that old adage of the nail that sticks out gets nailed back in, kind of the way that the Eastern mentality of people that stick out. And so that's sometimes used in our culture in order to give us corrective behavior. And so unfortunately, shame is a big issue. And that's how we're defining it here on this podcast.
Yeah, and then shame for us, those of us in the Asian culture, whether we're in Asia or here in America as second generation, that is just so embedded in our culture. And, well, being the nature of shame, we don't talk about it. And so we're just beginning to learn. And in this conversation, we're just beginning to learn just how many facets and dimensions and layers there are to shame.
Yeah.
And so as we've been doing what we're calling erasing shame through honest talk for healthy living, I've been discovering that there's a sense of internal shame versus external. There's individual versus group. There's kind of the self-inflicted shame because we've done something wrong. We feel like there's something wrong with us versus abuse that's inflicted by others. And there are so many more. Yeah. And just a month into this conversation, we're like, wow, we're getting into like a pretty deep hole, and it's pretty wide. But because it's never talked about, we had no idea that this was such a big thing. So I think we're going to have a lot of things to talk about, not just for one season, but for many seasons.
Yeah, definitely. I think even as we talk about this, I'm really struck by the story that I heard just sharing with a friend about our podcast and what we're doing. And I hear this a lot from young adults too, is that there's this sense of imposter syndrome. Have you heard about this? Do you know what that is, DJ?
I've heard the phrase, but let's remind me, please.
Yeah. It's basically just feeling like you're always, it's this sense that you're always going to get caught. You're masquerading, kind of wearing somebody else's shoes, if you will. So it's, I hear this a lot from people who are in the first job. They are they have their master's degree or their doctorate, and yet they still feel like a little child inside. And I had a friend particularly that was sharing with me about how she kind of grew up and did everything right, and went to the good schools and dated the right people and never really rebelled against her parents, did what they wanted her to do career-wise. And it was in her second year of residency that she really felt like, or second year out of school, that she really felt the sense of, I'm really afraid that I'm going to get caught one day, that someone's going to find out that I don't really know what I'm doing. And I think shame can definitely propel us in that direction. And unfortunately, there's so much in our culture. Our parents are always pressuring us to take the right route and do the right thing. The one that looks, the route that looks like it's the way that, so they can tell their friends that they have a child who's a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, and all those stereotypes. But it's a really prevalent thing. And I think it really causes us to doubt ourselves, and it really takes a knock at our self-esteem. So I think that there's definitely shame in that, in the way that we raise our kids.
And there's, now that you mentioned raising our kids, I know you're a young mom with little Grayson. How old is Grayson?
He is almost 10 months now.
Almost 10 months. Okay. I've been saying 1 or 1.5, so I've been overestimating, which would make him happy. I have a 20-year-old, so one thing I've been reflecting on is a sense of generational shame that our parents maybe did the best they could, but we've learned more in our new context and with communication like internet. There's a lot more information and knowledge that we can learn what's healthier parenting. But it's not just an Asian or Asian American thing with shame. It's really a human condition. And there's a song that I'm reminded of, that everybody hurts. And so I think one of the reasons that people have been so responsive to me as I share about starting this podcast is that everybody has some part in their life that hurts and that they're hiding. And partly for self-protection, partly for maybe they haven't found a place that's safe to share, or life is not perfect. We live in a fallen world that has brokenness, and so some things we do have to endure. And so I think this conversation opens that up for people to really explore and to find healthier ways to cope and manage that. But one of the questions I had was, we raised in an earlier episode 1 or 2, that shame can be a good or bad thing. And by the name of this podcast, we're kind of focusing and wanting to erase the bad shame. Yeah. But can you describe how shame can be good versus bad?
Yeah, so I always think about it as like healthy shame versus toxic shame. And so there is a healthy component to shame. Shame is one of our core emotions. And really the purpose of that is that it prevents us from damaging our social relationships and motivating us to repair them. And so back, I was reading this article about, back in the hunter-gatherer days, when everyone really relied on each other for survival, shame was something that kind of allowed people, kind of told people when they crossed the line, and they really wanted that sense of belonging and community. And so that's really, it kept them within that. And so I think about, especially right now in the media, there is the Me Too movement, there's the Church Too movement, there's the Time's Up movement. And so these are, stories of people that have done things that are very like assaulting people and harassing people. And so, these are stories of people that should be called out for some of the ways that they've crossed those boundaries socially. And so I think that could be a healthy shame, kind of calling out bad behavior. Or even like if you're driving, you cut someone off, in line, on the freeway. Or I was just at the grocery store last week, and somebody cut in front of like a little old lady in her grocery cart. And there's like social norms that we have that is a kind of a healthy shame. It keeps us in line. But then there's also the toxic shame, and that's kind of what we're here to erase. And that would be kind of the self-blaming, the addictions, the numbing that we all experience when we just feel like we walk around the world and we already feel inadequate, or we already feel like we're not full just as we are. And so I think that's the shame that we want to talk about in this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of what makes it toxic is when we don't talk about it and we try to carry all of that burden emotionally and mentally. It starts to wear away at our body physically as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Brene Brown, I don't know if it's recent, she came out with this TED Talk about vulnerability, the power of vulnerability, and how that's the opposite of shame. And it's just, I do think that the toxic shame is the kind of the requirement to eradicate that or to erase it is that sense of vulnerability and that sense of openness, which is unfortunately so uncomfortable for us that it's really hard to erase it.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're having this podcast, Erasing Shame, through healthy talk. And hopefully by our conversation, we're inviting others to also be honest with themselves and find one or two other trusted people to have a face-to-face conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how has this podcast caused response with people you've talked with in the past month?
I think that it's been really great to see how shame manifests differently in different cultures. So I was talking to my friend Carolina, and she's Latina and African American, and she was sharing about how in the Latino culture, there is a word for shameless, which is sin pena, or without penance, and how that is kind of the ultimate insult. It's like this brazen kind of shamelessness. So that was just really interesting to see how it played out in her culture, which is also a collectivist culture, kind of like Asian American culture. And then I've also heard that Germans experience a lot of shame because historically there's this historic shame of Germans being on the wrong side of a couple of wars, and how their sense of being German was what caused them to make these bad decisions, because being German was above everything. And I think as a Korean American, I can relate to that. I would like to think I have a strong ethnic identity, and how if that I could see how that could maybe blind me to kind of what is morally right and wrong. So yeah, I'm curious if you've had how your conversations have gone. I know you've been at a couple of different conferences, and I'd love to hear how your conversations have gone around this topic.
Well, I was talking with another podcaster at a professional media conference in Nashville a couple weeks ago, and she's more of a professional podcaster, so her production value and her distribution network is almost in the thousands, and she does a podcast out of Seattle about relationships and personal identity. And I was describing that, hey, I just launched a podcast about a month ago called Erasing Shame, and she was really receptive at hearing how I was launching. I said, yeah, I got no budget, so I'm just running it on Facebook Live, and we're beginning to get a growing number of people listening and watching and downloading the podcast and commenting. And so we're like a little snowball that's starting to build, and she was just really encouraging for us starting it that way, that the most important step is the first get started, and then we can always get better. Only the upside to go. And we don't need fancy equipment. So that was a real encouragement, and what we're talking about is really important, as she has recognized in her years of counseling, or not counseling, but advising people about relationships.
Yeah, and I imagine that there's some overlap too, because shame is very relational.
Indeed. And speaking of relationships, and I think you hinted at it, there's also the relationship, not just of one-on-one, but also one within a group. And that's the word we use for belonging. And so we had a episode, I believe it was episode number 2, episode number 3, called Not Belonging Anywhere. And that episode was like, and what it looks like when you don't belong, and how this sense of shame could be a factor for why you don't belong. What we did a little poll just to see what people would, how people respond when they feel like they don't belong. And one person, Natalie, said she gets anxious and circles around with racing thoughts. Lisa said, I observe myself silently judging people, and I isolate more, making plans to solve everything on my own and not need people. So actually justifying why she doesn't belong. And that's just not a healthy thing if that group is a place that you should belong to and you have something to contribute. For those of us in a bicultural background, I recently just yesterday, I found a quote from comic artist Jean Yang, and he described that the conflict that many children of immigrants know very well is the immigrant values and cultures can leave them caught between, for Asians, honoring their parents versus pursuing their dream. And that really contributes to their sense of alienation and shame.
Yeah, I think that immigrant experience definitely would elevate that.
So that sense of not belonging and being in two worlds and not having a place where you just feel like you can let your guard down, be yourself, and be at home, it does overlap with shame, but it's not identical to shame. Because sense of belonging could also be other things. It could be weight or social class or even mental health when you're in a context where everybody seems to have it together, and then you obviously struggle and have some behavioral issues that don't fit the norm.
Yeah, I think and there's one more comment too from Joe, and he said I build an anti-click. I'm wondering, I feel like that's probably similar to what Lisa said, is kind of creating kind of the opposite of creating a new group and kind of rebelling against the system. I thought that was so interesting because it's almost like Steve actually asked, what are some ways that Asians escape shame? And one of the ways that I think is kind of what these two are alluding to, which is that there's a lot of blame that goes around, but it's very subversive. And so, like there's a reputation of for Korean churches that they split a lot. And, part of it is rumor, part of it is true, but I think some of it has to do with the fact that there's just a lot of anger and a lot of blame that goes along. And so whether that comes from comparison or whether it comes from gossip or whether it comes from actively building something against the current institution, I think that there's definitely a lot of that going on. I think everywhere, but particularly in Asian American circles, or as Brene Brown says, it's taking things that are uncertain and making them certain. So, taking religion or taking a stand on politics or social justice that's something that should be kind of in the gray area or, not so black and white, and making it black and white and kind of living for that cause. And I feel like I've seen that a lot.
Yeah, and that makes me think of our current cultural condition with the polarized politics and the polarized issues of political correctness and whether it's racial identity or gender identity or well, I don't need to get into all of them, but just that we as humans are relational creatures and we are driven to belong. So if we don't belong in one group and we're rejected because of shame, then we'll find others who can relate to us and create a new group, like gangs or like the white supremacist racists and some other groups that are just becoming more and more harmful because they've been harmed. A little pithy quote I've heard: hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that initially when we talked about shame, we were talking about how it's a race and community. And I think I was the person that said that in, I think, our third or fourth episode. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that people can have a very strong reaction against that phrase because I think people have been hurt by community. And people have been hurt by being vulnerable and not getting their needs met. And so I think that to kind of add on to it, and it's not just community, it's really a safe, empathetic community that is where shame can disappear. I I've seen this done really well, and I've seen this done in a very, to use a psychological word, codependent way, where people are depending on each other to get their needs met, and it becomes very messy and not healthy. And so there's a couple different ways, but I do think that there is kind of like what you're saying about some of these groups that are popping up while they're not while they're bringing a lot of damage. It comes to serve internal human need of belonging that I think everyone has.
Yeah, very much so. It's too bad. There's some communities that enforce such a unrealistic standard that when someone fails or someone doesn't measure up or doesn't fit that community anymore, because hey, we're all human and there are times that we will fail, that community will reject them. And that's too bad. That community will just get smaller and smaller in a matter of time. And the other thing that happens is people will pretend to belong when they actually have failed or do have struggles, just to belong to that community. And so it can also implode from the inside out. Yeah. Well, we have a few more minutes in this podcast. Let's start wrapping up. If there's some last thoughts that you want to share as you look at the past month and the different feedback that we've gotten, and as we've had a week off, that was nice to have.
Yeah,
we can get back into the routine here.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that we've seen that people are listening to this podcast, and I would really like to ask the listeners to share their own stories of, of shame, and also of experiences where shame is erased. I think I was listening to a podcast recently where they were saying that when they asked for stories of belonging, they heard stories when they didn't belong. So I guess what I want to ask our listeners is to share stories of belonging, and also times where they didn't feel like they belonged. Because I've run into people just randomly at events or parties where they've heard about our podcast and have told me story after story of people they've heard I think the recent one was a girl who didn't get into USC, and her dad said, "What kind of daughter are you?" And there's just these really intense stories. But I would love to hear them from our listeners, and to get permission to share those, because we know that your stories are sacred, and we want to honor them as that. And we would love to hear if you want to share what your stories are about erasing shame.
Yeah, you can share your stories with us through Facebook Messenger, and that will be private. And also through our website, erasingshame.com, and click on the contact page. And let us know if you would like to keep it anonymous, or if you want to just share it and have us keep it confidential and not mention it. Or if you don't mind having us share your story anonymously with our audience so that it can help other people too. Any of those three things can help you experience more freedom and shame, from shame as well. That's something I've experienced too, that when we're able to give voice, that point of shame and hurt, by talking it out, it begins to lessen that pain and moves us towards healing.
Yeah.
There's a lot more involved in that, but I think that's one of the first steps.
Yeah, definitely. And DJ,
the other thing I would encourage is for you to share this podcast with others. Just as it's been a conversation starter for me and for Eunice, you can share this podcast with others on social media or over email and say, "Hey, I found this really interesting podcast called Erasing Shame. What do you think?" And that's a great way to have it become a conversation starter for you and the people that you're connected to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
I think I'm excited about some of our guests that we're going to have in the next month or so. We're going to have a psychologist come and talk about anxiety and OCD. We're going to have another therapist come and talk about her dissertation of the immigrant experience and how it impacts the parent-child relationship. And we're going to have a social advocate come and talk about her movement in mobilizing progressive Asian American Christians. So we have a lot of really exciting things coming up. Yeah, so I'm excited. How about you, DJ?
Oh, I'm very excited for what you and our team has been doing. So our third team member that we will get to introduce with our viewing and listening audience next week will be Natalie Shea. And she is also a young mom like Eunice, and been helping us with organizing our episodes and giving us structure and a backbone to talk about on each episode. And so Eunice we will have a great conversation next about being young moms and what they've experienced through that journey. Mm-hmm. So I think this next month will be very valuable and give us even broader insight into erasing shame.
Great. All right. Yeah. So don't forget to tune in. Let us know your stories. Shoot us a message, and if you have a conversation with a friend about this podcast or surrounding this, we'd love to hear from you as well. So, yeah, please let us know.
Okay, Eunice, you can do our sign off. Tell people how to stay in touch with our team and how to subscribe.
Yeah. So, you can find us on Facebook Live, or you can go on at Erasing Shame, or you can go on our website, erasingshame.com. Our videos are up on YouTube, so you can share that way. And also we're on iTunes, thanks to DJ. And so you can find us on iTunes at Erasing Shame.
Awesome. Thank you, Eunice.
Thanks, DJ.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.